Okay, right. Any questions you have, type them. I'll try and answer them on the screen. Hello, everyone. This is John O'Shea. This is the third of 3 tutorials, the final tutorial on the Merchant's Prologue and Tale. Remember, you've got a mock on this next week, and your text is the Prologue and Tale. It's very important you talk about both. Don't go into the exam talking only about the tale or only about the prologue. Okay, so let's consider where we got to in our last tutorial. Okay, we got to the garden, and January is with May, and he's got his wicket, and he's got his click it to the wicket, his key to the garden, and the key and the lock symbolism is sexual and would bring amusement to Chaucer's audience. And we're reminded that he wants May entirely to himself on page 71. No one else. He is struck by jalousie, okay, J-A-L-O-U-S-I-E. Always try and quote in the Chaucerian spelling if you can. It gives the appearance that you know the text really well, and examiners like it. Okay, in many ways, the Merchant's Tale and also the whole category tales can be almost a retelling of the 7 deadly sins. And perhaps one of those sins here is the sin of jealousy and covetousness. He wants to keep it under lock and key in the garden. However, for his punishment, he is struck blind. Okay, blindness is often associated with oversex, so maybe there's a comic element in his ailment. Okay, but blind is also symbolic. January is blind to his own age. He thinks he's an evergreen tree. He thinks he's like a pike who's ever strong. He thinks he's never going to get old. That's the tragedy of all men. They think that. But the irony is that he is. And so there's an irony of self with January that's always really amusing, that he thinks he's much more virile than he actually is. Okay, and this is where he gets his penance. Right, I'll be using a combination of quotes from Mr. Doré and ad-libbing myself, and I'll be going from page 73 to the end of the tale, and I'm hoping to do it in 35 minutes. Forgive me if I go fast. It's obviously at pace quicker than it would be in class, but you have the virtue of stopping me from the video and pausing it and carrying on. Okay, let's see what the first slide has for us. Okay. On page 73, a little earlier than the summary suggests, if you take the top of the page, Chaucer always very much likes repeating lines that he's used earlier in the tale. The merchant begins his prologue by talking about weeping and wailing, care and other sorrows and worries he knows full well because he's been married. And interestingly, line 860, January, we find out he's weepeth and he waileth piteously, and therewith all the fire of jalousie takes hold of him. So again, what strikes down the merchant strikes down January. Always be aware of the connections between the two. Okay. Just before I move on, can everyone else hear me? Can you confirm that you can hear me? I know Lola can. Just type in, just let me know that you're there if you like. However, he is not the only one weeping and wailing. Thank you. Damien in the garden, who's not yet in the garden, he weepeth, line 880, he weepeth for fresh May. Again, the adjective is ironic about May being very fresh. This idea of her virginity or her youth is always coupled with the description of wintry January. But Damien, like a courtly lover, and I repeated courtly love last tutorial, I'm not going to repeat it again, he takes on the role of the courtly lover, weeping and for the woman that he can't have. Okay, So, on lines 895, page 75, we have an example of apostrophe. This is where the narrator, the merchant, addresses January in person, but January doesn't hear him. It's a little bit like a narrator in a book addressing a theme or addressing a character who can't hear them. And it's a technique Chaucer uses quite often. "O January, what might it thee avail, though thou might so as far as a ship's sail? For as good as blind deceived be, as to be deceived when a man can see." Okay, Shakespeare takes on the same theme. You might as well be blind because the eyes aren't going to give you any understanding. For as good as blind deceived be, as to be deceived when a man can see. So the narrator, the merchant, is addressing January and saying, you know, you were blind anyway because you're so easily deceived, and maybe self-deceiving. The narrator then goes on, line 900, to talk about there's more than one person, more than one January who's been deceived. So been more than when wisely that it be not so. Pass over is an ease, I say no more. Maybe there's a confession there from the narrator that he's another person who's been deceived by women, by his wife, as he hints at the start of his prologue. So again, this idea of men being deceived is kind of reoccurring in this text. And I think that's an example of the narrator hinting that he is one of them. So we've got the May gives through warm wax the cricket to enter the garden. And again, remember the warm wax that that January said earlier, that he wants a young woman who, like warm wax, he can mold and shape, because an old woman can't control him. So again, Chaucer often uses the same language to describe. He repeats the same language in a different context later on. So Damien steals into the garden. May enters the garden, and January promises everything to May. He swears that he loves her, and he apologizes for being so jealous. Let's turn over the page. Page 77, we have January being quite romantic. He paraphrases the Song of Solomon. Often Chaucer makes allusions or references to other texts. And the Song of Solomon is very, courtly love, romance, poetry. And January uses it here. So he says, rise up unto May. Rise up, my wife, my love, my lady free. The turtle's voice is heard, my dove sweet. So there's the irony of January being quite romantic towards his wife and using this Song of Solomon. But all the time, Damien has entered into the garden. The serpent is in the garden, if we want to carry on the allusion to the Garden of Eden. Remember, allusion with an A is important, not illusion, where rabbits come out of hats. Okay. So this brief romantic interlude is merely the merchant's way of pausing the action. We want to know what happens. So immediately something that we want to know what happens, the narrator stops the pace and gives us a digression. So here we've got a romantic interlude, but really it's continuing the theme of appearance versus reality. January is appearing to be the romantic lover, quoting from and paraphrasing the Song of Solomon. Come forth with thine eyes, Columbine, how fair be thy breasts than wine. So he's comparing her breasts to being sweeter than wine. But the fantasy he has of romance clashes with the reality. Appearance is different to reality because Damien is about to climb up the tree. All the time he's doing this, May signals to him, get up the tree. and Damien climbs the pear tree. Now, let's talk a little bit about the pear tree. Not as eloquently as Miss Grattan has in her essay that I sent to you this week, but this idea of adultery taking place up in a pear tree is quite a common story. On one level, we can see the pear tree being like an allusion to the apple tree and the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden story, so a biblical allusion. But it's also a literary allusion to other stories from the Decameron or from other stories throughout history that Miss Gretton's research has uncovered. And the idea of a pear tree, this story of adultery would be familiar to the audience. So again, there's an irony perhaps lost on us, that Chaucer's audience would probably be familiar with where this story is going because of the clues of the pear tree. So always be aware of the literary context. If you want a bit more detail, read Miss Gretton's essay about the same old story. And again, it's the story being retold. So on lines 937, such old lewd words used he, on Damien a sign made she, and that he should go before him with his clickets, that Damien then opened the wicket. So some people say that at this point in the story, we start to have a little sympathy for January. And that's up for argument. But let's turn over the page and see what the deal is that January wants to make with May. Okay. Let's, okay. Well, I'm not going to get to Pluto and Proserpina's argument, but on page 79, and this is where I think maybe there is a little bit of sympathy for January, but then I am 52, and so I am sympathetic to him. He says, though that I be old and may not see, be'eth to me true, and I will tell you why. So there's a degree of maybe he understands himself, whereas before there was a lack of self-identity. He knows he's old, he can't see, but he says, look, I want you to be true. And if you're true, you shall win 3 things. Now, again, you don't have to understand every line of Chaucer, but you've got to get the gist of it to really appreciate it. He says, you shall win 3 things. Firstly, love of Christ, which is always good. And you shall win honour, number 2. And you shall win all mine heritage, town and tour, town and country. And I leave it to you to make the charters as you list. I leave it to you to draw up the contracts. So he's saying, look, if you stay true to me as an old man and as a jealous old man, I know. But he says he doesn't do it for jealousy. He says on line 55, I do it only for love that I had thee, not for covetise. Covetousness is the sin of jealousy or selfishness. So it's debatable whether we can totally sympathize with him. But he says, I'm old and I'm jealous, but I love you. Stay with me and you shall win 3 things. Love of God, honour, and all my worldly possessions. But on line 965, he admits, and though that I be jaloux, remember, try and spell it like that, J-A-L-O-U-S, with me naught. So he says, that's it, that's the deal. I'm jealous. I want you, and I want you to stay with me and not marry anyone else and not be out of my company. That's it. Turn to page 81. What do we learn from May? And this is perhaps a really interesting page because up until now, May doesn't really give us too much. She's quite quiet throughout the tale, but here she gives her riposte. Here she gives her counter arguments. Okay, and in many ways, the strong woman presentation here is something that you could start to maybe think about with the Duchess of Malfi, where she makes a speech against the misogyny of her age. So I think it's quite an interesting quote. So page 81, she says, then she said these words, benignly, softly to January, But first she began to weep. I have, quoth she, a soul for to keep, as well as ye, and also mine honour, and of my wifehood, like a tender flower, which I've given into your hand, when that you pressed your body to mine. So she says, look, I have my own honour I wish to keep, and my soul, and I made a vow in marriage. And she says, starve me, on lines 985, starve me if I should bring any shame, my kin that shame. If I should do adultery like other women, starve me. Or else, if I should impair so my name, if I should bring my family name into disrepute, or if I should be false, she says, then put me in a sack and drench me in the river, line 990. So there's the animal imagery there again, isn't there? Drench me in the river. She goes, so if I should do these things, drench me, drown me like a cat or a kitten. Now she's quite persuasive. Why speak ye thus? Rhetorical questions, he says. Why are men always so untrue? But men always speak to us of untrust and reprieve, she says. Why is that? Now, that's a kind of valid, argument that she makes. There is a full of misogyny in this tale and in the merchant's prologue. But this is undercut, ironically, her powerful speech about her own honour, her own chastity, her own fidelity, is ironically undercut in the next paragraph, where she fingers a sign up to Damien to climb the tree. Okay, so there's an ironic juxtaposition between what she says, her appearance, and the reality of what's going on up the tree. So always think about irony when you think about the presentation of characters. Okay, so that's kind of clear. Right. Okay, Damien's up the tree. What does Chaucer do? Chaucer always gives us a digression. He always gives us a digression just at the moment when we want to know what happens. And so here we've got the classical allusion to Pluto and Proserpina. Okay, and here you've got the background. Pluto's the old guy, and he carries off Pluto. He carries off Proserpina, the young girl, for 6 months of the year, takes her underground. She's his willing prisoner. So again, these two are in a similar kind of parallel marriage, the old guy with the young wife, and they are in conflict as well. So even in the classical fairyland of these kind of classical characters, these gods, marriage is still a kind of conflict between man and woman. Okay. So whenever Chaucer wants to slow down the pace, he starts getting all poetic. So on page 83, there's lots of descriptions of the time of the day. Bright was the day, the firmament, Phoebus half of gold, glade in every flower. He was the time in Gemini, I guess. There's always references to astronomy, and astrology in Chaucer. So we've got this kind of poetic description. All Chaucer's doing is slowing down the pace because we want to know what happens with May and what's his name up in the tree. Okay, but these fairy kingdom are watching what's going on down the ground, and Pluto, the old man, the old god, is not happy about it. And why would he be? Because he sees in January perhaps a little bit of himself. And like the merchant and January, he shares some of the views of women. So let's look at his views on lines 1025. The experience so proveth every day, my wife, the treasons which that women doen to man. 100 tales tellen I can of your untruth and brottleness. Brottleness was a word that was used by January earlier in the tale, where he says, single men live in brittle or brottleness, like unsure, unsafe ground. they're fragile. And this is what Pluto says about his wife. There's a reference to Solomon, a classical allusion. Solomon was so wise and richest of men, he never had a good word to say about women. Among 1,000 men, he might have found one good one, but he never found one good one amongst women. Not only him, but Jesus, not Jesus Christ, but Jesus of Phileas Sirach's son. So the author of Ecclesiasticus, so an Old Testament author. He says that women are corrupt. They've got a wildfire on page 85, a corrupt pestilence that falls on their body. So we're not seeing very nice things being said about women coming from Pluto. And look at this honourable night, he says. Again, that's ironic. Always any reference to January is an honourable or worthy is always ironic. Alas, that he is blind and old, and his own man shall make him cuckold. So again, cuckold, a cuckold was an old word used to describe a deceived husband, and so it's used to describe January here. And Pluto's not having any of it. He's saying on line 1050, he shall know of her harlotry. Again, he shall know of her, what's the word? Harlots, her sexually promiscuous behavior. Let's put it that way. And he shall see it on line 1060 with his own yen. I spy with my little iron yen. So he's going to see it with his eyes. Page 87. Let's turn over the page. So there's arguments back and forth between Pluto and Proserpina. Pluto arguing that men are the victims and he's going to restore January's sight. Well, obviously, Proserpina is not going to let him have the last word on this. So let's see what she says. Page 89, 20 minutes left. I set right naught of all the villainy that ye of women write a butterfly. She doesn't give a butterfly, she doesn't give a monkeys what he thinks about women. I am a woman, needs must I speak, or else shall my heart break. For saith he said that we've been jungleresses, prostitutes. So she says, I'm not going to hold my tongue. So she reminds us a little bit of the riposte made by May a little bit earlier. She says, I'm not going to hold my tongue. Pluto says, don't be angry anymore. I'm going to give him his sight. So that's it. And then she says, well, I'm going to, on line 1105, and I, quote she, a queen of fairies. Notice how I jump from paragraphs. If you get the gist of each paragraph, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to stop for questions in a moment. Okay, so if you've got any questions you want to type, if I haven't explained something very clearly, type them and I'll have a little break to answer any questions before we move into the very final part of this text. Okay. Her answer shall she have, I undertake. Let us no more words make. Forsooth, I will no longer you contrary. So she says, I'm going to give her an answer. He can open his eyes all he wants, but I'm going to give her the answer. Right. Okay. That takes us back to 91. It's the end of this digression. Okay. We have to get to where we want to get. We want to know what's going to happen up the tree. Okay. Now, May says, I'm desiring, I so longeth, on line 1120, I longeth me to eaten of the small pears green above her in that tree. For her love that is of heaven queen. I tell you, well, a woman in my plight may have to fruit so great an appetite. So on lines 1, 2, 3, a woman in my plight, she's indicating that she's already pregnant. And there's an interesting comparison you can make with the Duchess of Malfi when you get here, that people start to suspect the Duchess of Malfi is pregnant when she desires apricots. Maybe it's a little bit like pregnant women having a craving for a certain food. But May is explicit here. She's saying a woman in my plight. Maybe she's hinting that she is already pregnant. And maybe this is a way of getting January to do her bidding. Because obviously that's a son and heir is what January wants. But perhaps being pregnant is also what May wants. Maybe that's her end goal herself, to have a baby. And Miss Gretton in her essay talks about that at length. You might want to refer to that. But the important thing is, she looks up in the tree and she sees some ripe fruits that she wants to taste. And again, the sexual connotations are there. It's Chaucer being deliciously ironic. What she wants in the tree, she wants to taste. Can be the fruit, or it can be Damien. And so the reader can see the irony in that. And she says, January says on line 1126, alas, I don't have a servant to help you up there. And she says, I know well enough what you can do at the end. She says, so my foot might set upon your back. So she actually gets January to become his own cuckold. She actually gets January to bend down so that she can stand on his back to jump up onto the tree. So again, the foolishness of this old man in this fableau is complete. January becomes his own footstool to his own adultery. Certes, quoth he, thereon he be no lack, might I ye help him with mine own heart blood. He stoopeth down, and on his back he stood, and caught her by a twist, and up she goeth. Right, she's finally up in the tree. The readers want to be told exactly what happens. Well, does Chaucer tell us? Does the merchant tell us exactly what happens? Ladies, and ladies in the audience, I pray you that you be not wrath, that you be not angry. I cannot gloss. I am a rude man. I cannot euphemize. I cannot sort of say it less crudely. I've got to tell you what actually happened because I'm rude. I'm a rude man. And suddenly, anon, this Damien gan pull up at the smock, and in he throng. So again, the sexual act is explicitly described, but not in a romantic way. In he throng. When that Pluto saw this, he decided to give January back his sight. So that exchange there, it's a narrative interruption. It's intrusive narrator saying, I'm sorry, I'm apologizing here. I can't gloss over it. I've got to tell it as it is. In he thong. So sometimes this mock kind of politeness or squeamishness is just an act, or it's the persona of Chaucer as the merchant. Okay, but I think it's quite ironic. He's pretending to apologize, but he really deliciously wants to tell us. Again, the reaction of poor January on getting his sight back. The merchant is surprisingly frank in his description, but does apologize. His sight is restored. And I think the comedy is in the line that January says. His first word is out, meaning Damien to get out of his wife. Help, alas, harrow, O strong lady store, what dost thou do? What are you doing? He catches her in the act. But she uses her gift of wit to talk her way out of the situation. She says, I've done this to help you because your eyes are blind. That was the best thing to do, to make you to see. That's the thing to do, is to struggle with a man upon a tree. God knows I did it for your good intent. Yes, but struggle, he said. He all gay in it went. Again, January's still obsessed about the penetration. It went in all the way. That's all he can think about. Then she said, well, your eyes have healed. If it didn't, my medicine has failed. You would not say in these words unto me, you have some glimpsing and no perfect sight. So she says, I think you're seeing things. Your sight isn't perfect. So again, Proserpina has given her the ability to talk her way out of trouble. Line 95, or page 95. January gives in, or does he? He accepts her excuse. Now, dame, quoth he, let all pass out of mind. I must have been seeing things. Come down, my leaf, and if I have missaid anything, God help me so, as I am evil paid. Forgive me, because I've been upset. But, yea, sir, quoth she, you may ween as loud lest. You may think as you like, but sir, a man that waketh out of his sleep, he may not suddenly well take keep upon a thing, nor see it perfectly, till that it be focused verily. Right so a man that long, this is line 1189, right so a man that long hath been blindy be, nay may not suddenly so well he see. So a man that's been blind so long may not suddenly see so well, she says. And again, the idea of blindness fits neatly in with the subject of appearance versus reality, because he's been blind all along. And then, and so this idea of appearance versus reality, which runs through the Duchess of Malfi as well. No one appears to be what they are in the Duchess of Malfi. And tragedies in Shakespeare and in the Duchess of Malfi always work on appearance versus reality. So this page is quite full of quotes to do with appearance versus reality. So, for many a man weeneth to seen a thing, and it is all another that it seemeth. So again, what we think we see is different to what we actually conceive. He that misconceiveth, he misdeemeth, she says. And with that word, she leapt down from the tree. He that misunderstands misjudges. And with that, she jumps down from the tree and has convinced him of her innocence. So, now we finish with the merchant. He says, who is glad this January? Who is glad but he? He kisseth her and clippeth her full often, and on her womb he stroketh her full soft. Is January deceiving himself here, willfully, or is he fully deceived? Is he still blind to what's in the womb? Is he just happy that he now has a baby, which is what he wanted, a son and heir? Is May happy? Is that what May wanted, was a baby, and now she gets it? But he stroketh her on her womb full softly. Thus endeth my tale, says the merchant on page 95. And so we end on the reaction of to this story. The host sums it up. And it's interesting that the host is the final of men to confess that he has a shrew of a wife as well. His reaction, aye, God's mercy, Jesus Christ, might be a modern version of it. Now such a wife I pray keep from me. Please keep a wife like that from me, he says. Lo, what sleights and subtleties, how deceiving women be. Again, they're as busy as bees, be they, us silly men for to deceive. And silly here means naive, innocent. So again, he reinforces this idea that women deceive. And from the sooth, from the truth, every woe they weave. So again, their ability to weave lies. This tale proves it. The merchant, sorry, the host goes on to give us a little description of his wife. He says, although she's true, she's not adulterous. I have a wife, on line 1 to 15. Though she be poor, but of her tongue a labbing shrew is she. Again, the idea of a woman as a sort of vicious little animal. And yet she hath a heap of vices more. They're of no force, let all such things go. But never mind, in council be it said, me rueth sore, I am unto her tied. So the host himself says, I rue the day, I regret the day I ever married her. So there's a kind of cyclical end to this story in which the merchant tells us of a marriage that he's regretting, and it ends with the reaction of a host who says the same thing. Me rueth sore, I am unto her tied. But I don't want to say any more about it, he says, lest in some manner it should get back to her. And I think he's referring to the wife of Bath. He's afraid that the wife of Bath might, if he says any more, might tell it to his wife. So it needeth not for to declare, since woman can out of such shepherd and out of my suffice to tell and all. So I can't understand every single word of that, but he's saying I don't want it to get back to my wife via the wife of Bath. And wherefore my tale is due. So he ends by saying that's the end of my particular tale, the host. Okay, so this is a story in which the merchant's misogyny and poor marriage lead him to tell a story of misogyny and poor marriage and deception. But he also tells us of Fablo, in which January is equally self-deceptive. And irony is used to highlight that self-deception. Because this is a Fablo, it's a well-known story. It's a story retold. The pear tree story is a story retold and retold in different cultures. And so, rather like a horror film in which we get enjoyment from knowing that we're going to be scared, the audience know what to expect in a story like this. So Chaucer often delays the inevitable because he knows the audience know what's going to happen. So there's an irony. Chaucer writes in the ironic persona of a merchant. Let's be clear about that. This isn't Chaucer being misogynistic. It's Chaucer writing in the persona of a misogynist. A little bit like Sacha Baron Cohen acts in the persona of Borat from Kazakhstan. Okay, don't mistake the writer and the writer's values for the values in the character that they present to us. Okay, that's correct. That's sometimes a mistake. Okay, I don't have any more to say, but are there any questions that anyone wishes to ask me? The pear tree story and how it would be recognizable is a good question to Chaucer's audience. Robert, if you read Miss Gretton's story, The Same Old Story, she's making comparisons between the Merchant's Tale and the Bloody Chamber stories. And stories about deceptive wives run through history. We get them in the collection of Boccaccio's Decameron, which is a collection of stories, a little bit like the collection of stories in 1001 Arabian Nights. And I think the story reoccurs in the Arabian Nights as well. And these stories would have been retold as oral stories as well. The idea of the foolish old man marrying the young wife is a story that can be found in African oral tradition as well. So in many ways, it's almost a universal story retold in different societies. And I think to give a better account of that and where it comes from, read Miss Gretton's account of that. But I think this kind of story is also told in Fablo again and again. I think what Chaucer does is also brings in the illusion of the Garden of Eden story and Damien being the snake within the garden to give it that added kind of resonance. My last tips to you would be Don't feel like you have to quote whole couplets. Sometimes individual words or 2 words can be enough. Do make the attempt to use the spellings of names and words that are in Chaucer. I think it has the appearance of being more academic. Remember that you are comparing this to the Duchess of Malfi, but for next week, you're just doing a sole essay on this. Try to go into the exam and see it as 2 things, the prologue and the tale. Also try to remember how this tale relates to other marriage tales. And so this tale is told as a reaction to the Clerk's Tale, the student of Oxenford, of Oxford, who tells a story about a loyal wife who's put through really cruel trials to test her loyalty. And she overcomes all of them, to the extent of having her kids taken away, being imprisoned, and being told her kids are dead. And she still loves her husband despite that. So this is a story almost in reaction to that equally unrealistic wife. It's also a story in reaction to the wife of Bath story, in which she proudly tells us about deceiving her husbands. And she tells a tale about what women want. What women want in her tale is to have mastery, to have dominance over men. And we can see how that's kind of reoccurring in this story as well. There's a kind of a power play between men and women runs through all of these stories. The Miller also tells a fableau in which an old carpenter marries a young wife, and that she is deceived by his lodger, and she sleeps with the lodger. And again, the idea of a fableau, an old man being fooled because he was stupid enough to marry a young wife, is retold in the Miller's tale. So having an awareness of where this tale sits within the whole Canterbury Tales is also an interesting context to have. Right, okay, that brings us up to 5 o'clock. Are there any more questions before I finish? Okay, well, thank you for your time. I hope you found it useful. I will put this video onto our website, Woodhouse English Department. Should you need to refer to the other 2, you could find it by going onto Google and just typing in Woodhouse English Department, and you'll find the previous lectures. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Thank you. Bye.